Hello friends and welcome to the channel. In this video, we will be covering some of the basic and advanced tips to improve your Melee DPS gameplay. This video is mainly aimed towards the Melee DPS role, but some of this information could also prove valuable to the tank role and also good knowledge to have for the other roles to get a better understanding of the Melee DPS role. In this video, we're going to cover some basic and advanced tips. We'll then move on to strategies to keep uptime. We'll go over greed, we'll go over the limit breaks, and we're also going to go over the cross-roll actions. If there's any information you want to skip to, you can utilize the timestamps in the description below, but otherwise, please enjoy the video. Let's begin with the ABC, always be casting. This applies to melees as well. Yes, you don't cast, but the concept is the same. Always have your global cooldown rolling when you can. Disengaged from the boss, use your ranged attack. No boss to attack, build up your resource if you have access to it. For example, monks have chakras which they can build up, and samurai has the Kenki gauge which can build up with the usage of meditate. On the topic of resource building, you may or may not have heard to never overcap your resource. While this is mostly true, and this might be a reoccurring thing I say throughout this video, but there is a different dynamic between Savage raiding and Ultimate raiding. While in Savage raiding, it's usually just one encounter, and you should in most cases never overcap. Although maybe you are killing an ad, and one more GCD will kill that ad without spending your resource, but it will overcap your resource. This is a good instance where overcapping isn't such a bad thing. As for ultimates, these are gauntlets of fights, and sometimes DPS can be held for the next phase, which can be another instance where overcapping isn't a bad idea, as you can enter a new phase with full resources. Next up, let's talk about the GCD and avoiding clipping into your GCD as much as possible. Yes, this does happen. Just try to keep it to a minimum. We're all human and we all make mistakes during our rotation. Although consistently clipping your GCD throughout an encounter is going to cost you a lot of damage. So how can we avoid this? Personally, I spam my GCD and that's a viable way. You can also queue your GCDs too. For the most part, the game will follow up with your queued GCD as long as it isn't macroed. Staying on topic of GCD clipping, be aware of what you can and can't double weave. First off, what is double weaving? Double weaving is when you use 2 off global cooldowns during your global cooldown, which in most cases, most jobs can do, but there are some exceptions like Dragoon jumps. Ninja and Monk's fast combo speed also makes it difficult to double weave with certain long OGCD animations, so just be aware of these. You'll learn them over time, but one thing worth noting is that when an OGCD is about to come off cooldown, but so is your GCD, in most cases it's worth to do your GCD first and then press the OGCD to avoid clipping into your GCD. My last 2 basics are to do with your combos, and the first one, and I know it goes without saying, right, is make sure to read your tooltips and follow your combos correctly. I have guides on all of the Melee DPS going into great detail at the tooltips, combos, and utility that they all have to offer, along with their rotations and openers to give you a good baseline of how to play them. Do note that some of these guides are slightly outdated, but they should give you, as I've said, a good baseline into how to play this job and a good understanding of it as well. Also, don't slack on your positionals, as the damage will add up over time if you consistently miss them. Remember to take advantage of your 2 charges of True North when you can't realistically hit a positional. Let's now touch up on uptime. First, the tools to keep uptime. This includes gap closers, anti-knockback, and max melee range. Our gap closers include Monk's Thunderclap, Dragoon's Elusive Jump, Ninja's Sakuchi, Samurai's Hisatsu Gyotan, and Reaper's Hell's Ingress. Now, some melees have access to more than just those gap closers, but for the most part, we want to familiarize ourselves with those gap closers. We want to use these when the boss disengages us, or when the boss becomes untargetable and becomes retargetable, and then we want to get back to the boss ASAP with our gap closers. Do note that if a boss does become untargetable and has a specific spot where it lands back onto the arena, that we are pre-positioning ourselves in the spot that the boss is going to land again, as long as it isn't a danger zone the moment it lands. That way, we are pre-positioned, ready for the boss to come back down and ready to attack it straight away. If not, we have our gap closers available to us, and that is when we're going to utilize them as well. Next up is our anti-knockback, which is arm's length. This is going to prevent most knockbacks from knocking us back when we use this ability. So we want to use this to keep uptime when there is a knockback in an encounter going off, and this is just going to keep our uptime rolling, and it's going to be beneficial for our overall DPS. So make sure you know when a attack is going to knock you back, and make sure you utilize arm's length to keep uptime. And finally, we have max melee range. Now, max melee range is when you position yourself so far away from the boss, but you can still hit your GCDs. This does take getting used to doing, but you can make micro adjustments during when your GCD is rolling to get a feel for when you are at max melee range. Now, your auto attacks do surpass your max melee range, so you don't have to worry about missing auto attacks when you're trying to make your micro adjustments to max melee range. So don't worry too much about that. You're going to keep uptime. Just make sure that you can hit the boss again once your GCD has come off cooldown. You can utilize max melee range for a lot of in and out mechanics to keep uptime rolling. And there's a few other mechanics here and there that allow you to be max melee range, but no closer. And this is very fight specific, so you're going to have to familiarize yourself with a fight. But when people talk about max melee range, this is what it means. So get used to getting better at max melee range. It's not too difficult, so don't worry too much about it. Don't overthink it. In time, you're going to get used to it, and it's just going to become natural to you to go max melee range when an encounter calls for it. Next up, I have some tips, and this is to pay attention to your fellow melee, and this includes tanks as well. In a standard composition, you'll run 2 melee and 2 tanks. This is more than enough room to fit around a boss, even with the biggest spread markers, AoEs, in the game. Now, when you're doing duty finder or party finder content, you might run into compositions with more than 2 melees, and this is honestly less than ideal, but it isn't all doom and gloom. If someone has to disengage at this point, it should be one of the tanks, and one of the melees could potentially take that tank's spot and keep uptime. Do not disengage for a tank unless they seriously need that spot for a tank mechanic, like a tank burster or something. But in most cases, the tank should disengage for you because you will be outputting more damage than the tanks. Keep this in mind as a tank player too, but you won't have to think about it much unless there are 3 or more melee in a standard content. Okay, let's talk about greed now. The first point is know when to greed and not to, and I will touch up on that a little bit more. But first, let's talk about what greeding actually is. In simple terms, greeding is when you go in for that last GCD just before having to go to position for a mechanic or to dodge an AoE, or keeping uptime at a potentially dangerous spot to discover it's actually safe to keep uptime with tight character placement and positioning, or maybe going in for that positional that could be potentially dangerous. The list does go on, and it's very fight and job specific, but that's what greeding is in a basic format. Now, we have to weigh in the worth of greeding. What is the situation? Is it a prog point in progression, or is it a point you're way past? Is the DPS check even an issue to risk the greed, or are you consistently getting past the DPS check? Will it cause a wipe even if you mess it up? Is it late into the encounter? All of these things you have to consider before greeding. It's also worth mentioning, like I've said previously, there's a completely different dynamic between Savage and Ultimate raiding. For the most part, greeding is quite acceptable during Savage raiding, as these fights are quite short. Although I'm not advocating you to wipe your party just to get a last GCD off, because Savage, it's just a lot more forgiving. Meanwhile, Ultimate fights are very long and mechanically intense, and when one player dies, this can result in a wipe due to a follow-up mechanic being scuffed or not meeting the enrage check, which in Ultimate fights are quite tight. But usually, as long as everyone plays well and doesn't die, they can easily be beaten. This is the opposite of Savage, but this time I'm not advocating you to not greed in Ultimates. Just remember to weigh in the risk versus reward, and don't cause your group to die 10 minutes into a fight just because my uptime. Okay, next up, let's talk about limit breaks. Limit breaks consist of 3 levels for Melee DPS. This is the highest single targeting damage attack in the game, and for the most part will be used in a single target instance when there is only one enemy available to attack. If there is a caster in your group and there is 2+ enemies, then caster LB does outweigh Melee LB in pure damage, but this is very fight specific. All levels of limit breaks have varying damage and animation locks. The higher the level of the limit break, the higher the damage, damage, but the longer the animation of the limit break. You should familiarize yourself with this because this animation lock is important to know. You can't just limit break mindlessly, as mechanics could be coming up which could potentially kill you during the limit break, render the limit break useless and completely wasted. Learn the upcoming mechanics before you limit break. Although in lower end content you usually just limit break without too much thought, but when it comes to extreme, savage and ultimate content, do keep this in mind. Let's finish off the video with our cross-roll actions. To begin with, Second Wind. This is on a 120-second cooldown and it cures us for 500 cure potency. Now this is our personal self-heal. When healers call for you having to use your personals at a specific fight point, then this is what Second Wind is. This can prove very valuable during intensive, high-damaging mechanics. In lower end content, this can be used when you take damage you weren't meant to and top yourself back up for an upcoming mechanic. In higher end content, this is our personal heal, and as I've mentioned, when healers call for you to use your personals, this includes Second Wind. Next up, we have Leg Sweep. This is on a 40-second cooldown, and it stuns the target for 3 seconds. Now, in most high end content, this will not be used, as the tanks will probably always cover stuns if a mob can be stunned in higher end content, although having a melee stun as a backup is always a good thing. The same can be said for lower end content. When we're doing a dungeon or something and an enemy does an AoE, but we want to keep uptime and keep our AoE rolling, for the most part I usually rely on my tank to stun it, but if I see my tank running away, then I will opt in to use Leg Sweep and keep my AoE rotation going off on the trash pack. Next we have Bloodbath. This is on a 90-second cooldown and it lasts 20 seconds. This is going to convert a portion of the physical damage we deal into HP, similar to Second Wind but not so instantly. This could also be classified as a personal, as it's going to gradually give ourselves HP back. So again, just like Second Wind, if your healers do call for you to use your personals, take into consideration Bloodbath, as it could just save you from these high intensity damaging mechanics. As for low end content, just like Second Wind, if we take damage we weren't meant to and we want to top ourselves back up for an upcoming mechanic, then do consider Bloodbath, as it can help you quite a bit. Next we have Feint. This is on a 90-second cooldown and it lasts 10 seconds on the target. This will lower the target's physical damage dealt by 10% and magical damage dealt by 5%. Now in the past this only lowered the physical damage dealt by 10% on the target, but now it lowers the magical damage dealt by that target by 5%. So because it now does this, we mostly use Feint on raid-wide AoEs because of that 5% magic damage is actually quite valuable. As for the physical damage dealt, not so valuable anymore. We used to use this on tank busters, but tanks have so many cooldowns at their disposal in Endwalker that we don't really need to worry about using Feint on tank busters nowadays. Mostly focus on using Feint on raid wides and raid busters. Your healers will call for you to use this on that kind of stuff in higher end content. As for lower end content, feel free to use this on whatever you deem necessary. Tank busters, raid wides, whatever. If it's lower end content, it doesn't matter too much. Just try and get used to using it and building some muscle memory into using it when you see a mechanic that could potentially benefit from being feinted. Next we have Arm's Length. This is on a 120-second cooldown and the knockback effect lasts 6 seconds. Now we did briefly go over Arm's Length and you know what it does. It's going to nullify most knockback and draw-in effects. So when we want to keep uptime on a target, we're going to use Arm's Length so we can keep our GCD rolling, but we have gone over it, so we'll leave it at that. Finally, we have True North. This is on 2 charges. It's on a 45-second cooldown and it lasts 10 seconds. This is going to nullify all action direction requirements. So what does that mean? If we were on, say, Ninja and we used Alonian Edge but at the front of the boss and we used True North, then we would get full damage even though we're at the front of the boss, because True North is going to take away the damage loss that we would have got if we didn't get the positional. So if we're at the front of the boss for any reason and our positionals are coming up, then use True North and keep that damage as high as possible. As I've said, I did go over True North a little bit here, but this is just to give you an idea of how you should be using it. Use it when you can't realistically hit those positionals and keep your damage as high as possible. I'd like to make a disclaimer just before I wrap up this video. This video should be treated as an educational video to give you a good idea of how to play the Melee DPS role. That doesn't mean everything I say in this video is gospel. Yes, I have fact-checked all of my points and I am not in any way giving you any false information. But as I have said, a lot of this stuff can be fight specific and I have tried to clarify that along the way. So just keep this in mind as you apply everything I have talked about. With that all said and done, my friends, that will be a wrap. I hope this video has proven informational to you and provided you some good insight into into the Melee DPS role to improve your gameplay or just give you a greater understanding of your teammates. If you enjoyed the video, please do give it a like, that would really help me a bunch. If you enjoy the content and aren't subscribed yet, then do consider hitting that subscribe button, as that also does really help me. If you have any feedback for this video or you want to add anything to this video, then please leave it in the comments below, or just let me know how you find the Melee DPS role. I'd be happy to hear any of your thoughts. With that all said, I shall see you guys in the next one, and until then, make sure to take it easy, stay safe, we out, goodbye.